I pulled into my driveway just after midnight, the kind of hour where the road feels abandoned and your thoughts won't shut up no matter how tired you are. I just left the hospital, sitting beside my mother while machines breathed for her, and all I wanted was to lock my gate, kill the engine, and let the silence swallow me for a while. Instead, my headlights caught movement. Someone was cutting my gate. A woman in polished boots and designer clothes stood there like she belonged on my land, bolt cutters clenched in her hands. 2 security guards hovered behind her, already shining flashlights across my yard like they were casing it. She didn't jump or apologize when she saw me. She smiled, said my name, and spoke with the confidence of someone who had done this before. She told me I owed thousands in unpaid HOA fees. She told me I had until Monday, or they would place a lion on my property. When I said I wasn't part of any HOA, "Not now, not ever," she laughed, not nervous laughter, but amused. Then she leaned closer and said, "Every property on this road belongs to us now. Easy way or the hard way." That's when it hit me. This wasn't a mistake. It was a takeover. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I need to explain how I ended up in this situation, because none of what happened was random, and none of it was an accident. My property sits at the very end of Maple Ridge Drive in a small town called Ashford Creek, the kind of place where the pavement narrows, the trees close in, and the streetlights quietly disappear. My uncle, Raymond Caldwell, built the house decades ago, long before anyone thought about master plan neighborhoods or community boards. He believed in 2 things: owning land outright and keeping paperwork airtight. He used to joke that fences rot, but documents don't. When he passed, the property came to me exactly the way he intended it to. Clear deed, private access, no shared roads, no covenants, no strings attached. Or so I thought. Closer to town, Maple Ridge looked completely different. Identical houses lined the streets like they'd been stamped out of a mold. Lawns were trimmed to the same height. Mailboxes matched. Little banners with the HOA logo hung from lampposts like quiet reminders of who was in charge. There were rules for everything: what color you could paint your door, how long your trash bins could stay outside, even how many days holiday decorations were allowed to stay up. I lived far enough away that none of it ever mattered to me. I waved to neighbors, kept my place tidy, fixed things when people needed help, and stayed out of HOA business entirely. For years, no one bothered me. That changed when leadership changed. The woman I caught cutting my gate was named Lauren Whitfield. She hadn't been around long, but everyone knew her name. Neighbors whispered it the way people whisper about storms forming offshore. After she took control of the board, fees went up almost overnight. Warning letters started showing up for the smallest things. People who questioned decisions suddenly found themselves buried in fines and inspections. One couple down the road told me they paid hundreds just to avoid the stress. Another family quietly sold their house and left. Lauren didn't run the HOA like a volunteer group. She ran it like a personal kingdom. At first, I didn't think any of that had anything to do with me. I wasn't part of their neighborhood, didn't attend their meetings, and didn't use their roads or amenities. But what I didn't understand yet was that my land sat right where their expansion plans pointed. My property bordered the newer development. On their maps, it was a clean edge. On their future plans, it was a problem. They couldn't expand cleanly without control over my land, and control was something Lauren believed she could take if she applied enough pressure. To her, I wasn't a homeowner. I was an obstacle. The morning after I confronted her at my gate, I barely slept. When the sun came up, I walked outside and found a bright orange notice taped right where the bolt cutters had been the night before. It declared I was in violation of HOA standards. It listed rules I had never agreed to, cited meetings I had never attended, and demanded immediate compliance, along with a growing list of fines. It was written with authority, stamped with logos, and phrased like a final warning. I read it 3 times, standing there in my driveway, feeling the anger rise and then settle into something colder. This wasn't sloppy. It wasn't careless. It was deliberate. Someone had decided that if they acted confident enough, official enough, I would panic and pay just to make it stop. Over the next few days, more letters followed. Each one escalated the language. Each one shortened the deadlines. One mentioned towing. Another mentioned legal action. None of them included a single document proving I belonged to their HOA. I started talking to neighbors quietly. That's when the pattern became clear. Lauren targeted people who lived alone, people who were older, people who were already tired or overwhelmed. She used paperwork the way some people use fists, fast, loud, and often enough that resistance felt pointless. And then there was me, a man dealing with a sick mother, trying to hold his life together, and suddenly facing threats over land he knew was his. Looking back, I understand why she chose that moment. She thought I'd be distracted. She thought grief would make me fold. Standing there with that orange notice in my hand, I realized something important. This wasn't going to stop on its own. And if I didn't draw a line right there, it wouldn't just be my land they took. It would be my silence, my peace, and eventually my home. I tried to handle it the reasonable way first, because I still believed there had to be some kind of mistake behind all of this. I emailed the HOA and kept it calm. I explained that my property was not part of their association, never had been, and that they needed to correct their records. I attached my address, my parcel number, and asked them to show me whatever document they believed gave them authority over my land. The reply came back in less than an hour. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't apologetic. It was cold and confident. One short paragraph stating that all properties on Maple Ridge Drive were automatically subject to HOA authority, and that failure to comply would result in enforcement action. No attachments, no proof, just certainty. That was the first moment I felt that knot tighten in my chest, not confusion anymore, control. Over the next week, everything accelerated. Another notice appeared on my gate. Then another one slid into my mailbox. Each one stacked new fines on top of old ones. Each one invented new violations. Each one shortened the deadline, like they were trying to keep me off balance. One letter warned about towing vehicles from my driveway. Another mentioned inspections. Another hinted at legal action if I didn't come into compliance immediately. One afternoon, I pulled into my driveway and saw the same 2 security guards from the night of the gate incident. They were walking my fence line slowly, taking photos, whispering into radios like they were documenting a crime scene. I asked them what they were doing on my property. They wouldn't answer. One of them finally said they had been instructed not to speak, only to observe. That word stuck with me. Observe. Like I was an experiment. That evening, neighbors started stopping by quietly, not all at once, one at a time. A retired couple down the road told me they had been threatened years earlier over landscaping rules they never agreed to. They paid just to make the letters stop. Another family admitted they were fined over made-up violations until they finally sold their house and moved away. A man I barely knew leaned in and said, "Once they lock on to you, they don't let go." That's when frustration turned into something sharper. The next morning, I went to the county clerk's office. I asked for everything tied to my land: deeds, surveys, parcel histories, records going back decades. I sat at a metal desk flipping through papers, while a clerk watched me like she already knew why I was there. And right there in black and white was the truth. My property had never been part of any HOA, not at formation, not later, not by amendment. It couldn't legally be absorbed without my written consent, and that consent didn't exist. The boundaries were clear. The dates were clear. There was no gray area. I made copies of everything. When I sent those documents to the HOA, I expected silence, or at least hesitation, maybe even a grudging retreat. What I got instead was Lauren. She showed up in person less than 2 days later. This time, she wasn't holding bolt cutters. She had a clipboard, a camera, and a teenager wearing a security shirt that looked more like a costume than a uniform. She announced she was conducting a mandatory compliance inspection and stepped onto my property like she had every right to be there. She started listing violations out loud. Fence height, structure placement, use of land. She spoke quickly, confidently, like speed itself could turn nonsense into authority. Every few minutes she paused to take photos, making sure the camera caught her badge and my address in the same frame. I asked her again to explain how she had jurisdiction over land that wasn't part of her HOA. She smiled and said, "That will be handled." That's when it finally clicked. She wasn't confused. She hadn't misunderstood a boundary or misread a map. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was betting that paperwork pressure, repeated threats, and public intimidation would wear me down. She was betting that I'd be too tired, too distracted, or too scared to keep pushing back. Standing there watching her walk my land like it belonged to her, I realized something else. This wasn't about rules. It wasn't about standards. It wasn't even about money. It was about dominance. And she was counting on me backing down before I figured out how deliberate all of it really was. The inspection really was a circus, and the longer it went on, the more obvious it became. Lauren walked my property with her clipboard tucked under one arm and her camera raised like a weapon. She pointed at things that had never been problems before and rattled off violation numbers, as if she were reading from a script she had memorized. My fence was suddenly the wrong height. My workshop was unapproved. Even the gravel on my driveway, gravel that had been there longer than the HOA itself, was now somehow non-compliant. Every accusation came with a fine attached, and every fine was spoken out loud. Before she made sure to film it, she never asked questions. She never paused to listen. The teenager in the security shirt followed her silently, looking uncomfortable, like he knew he was playing a role in something he didn't understand. What caught my attention wasn't what she said. It was where she kept looking. Every few minutes, her eyes drifted toward the trees at the edge of my property. There was a stretch of decorative fencing there, installed by the HOA years earlier, marking what everyone assumed was the boundary. But Lauren kept slowing down near it, glancing back and forth between the fence and her clipboard, like she was checking something without wanting me to notice. That night, after they left, I pulled out my uncle's old filing cabinet. Raymond Caldwell never threw anything away. Inside were yellowed envelopes, folded maps, stamped records, and surveys rolled so tight they snapped when I opened them. I sat on the floor and went through everything until my eyes burned. That's when I found it. A professionally recorded survey signed, sealed, and filed decades earlier. Clear lines, exact measurements. And right there, in ink that hadn't faded at all, was the truth. The HOA's decorative fence didn't just sit close to my property line. It crossed it. Not by inches, by several feet. I didn't sleep that night. Instead of confronting Lauren right away, I did what my uncle would have done. I verified. I hired a licensed surveyor and watched as he placed new markers into the ground. When he finished, there was no arguing it. The fence was on my land, always had been. I sent the HOA a certified letter the next morning, no emotion, No threats, just facts. I included the updated survey and demanded removal of the encroaching structure within 30 days. Lauren's response wasn't denial, it was fury. The pressure shifted immediately. Anonymous complaints started flooding the city. Accusations about my workshop operating illegally. Claims of unsafe structures. Noise, zoning violations. It was everything she could throw at the wall to see what would stick. That's how Daniel Perez showed up. He was a code enforcement officer, calm and professional, and he took his time inspecting everything. He measured. He checked permits. He asked questions. When he finished, he found nothing wrong. Everything was legal. Everything was in order. As he was leaving, he paused and lowered his voice. He told me this wasn't the first time he'd seen complaints like this tied to the same HOA. Same pattern. Same timing. Same escalation when someone pushed back. When his truck pulled away, I stood there for a long time looking at the new survey markers in the dirt. For the first time since this started, I didn't feel cornered. I felt backed up. And somewhere behind all of Lauren's threats and paperwork, I could finally see the outline of a mistake she was about to regret. Once the survey was confirmed, I stopped trying to handle this alone. I contacted an attorney named Michael Reeves, a quiet, methodical man who listened more than he spoke. I laid everything out on his desk: the deed, the surveys, the HOA notices, the inspection footage, the certified letters. He didn't react at first. He just read, page after page, line by line. Then he leaned back and asked me one question. Did your uncle ever talk about keeping this land independent? That question opened the door. Michael dug deeper into the older records, the ones most people never look at. Buried in the original closing documents was something my uncle had planned decades earlier: a recorded exclusion agreement. It wasn't vague. It wasn't symbolic. It permanently barred any present or future homeowners association from claiming authority over the land. And that wasn't the best part. The agreement included penalty clauses, real ones. Every unauthorized enforcement attempt triggered financial consequences against whoever tried it. Fines, legal fees, damages. My uncle hadn't just protected the land. He had laid a legal minefield and walked away. While Michael worked, the situation outside kept getting uglier. One morning I walked out to find my mailbox smashed at the base of the post. Another day, tools went missing from my workshop, not random items, but specific ones. The kind someone would take if they wanted to send a message. My security cameras caught Lauren's SUV driving slowly past my gate late at night, headlights off more than once. Then her husband showed up. Ethan Whitfield didn't come with paperwork or threats. He came with a smile and a tone that pretended we were just two reasonable adults trying to solve a misunderstanding. He suggested we settle this quietly. He implied that things could go away if I stopped pushing. He mentioned how stressful legal fights could be, especially with everything I had going on in my life. When I told him no, the smile disappeared. After that, the messages changed. Emails became sharper, deadlines shorter, language more aggressive. It was clear they believed pressure would break me before the law ever caught up. What they didn't know was that every move they made was being recorded. Every email was saved, every notice scanned, every drive-by logged, every conversation backed up. Michael told me to let them keep going. He said, the more they try to enforce, the stronger your case becomes. That's when I stopped feeling reactive and started feeling prepared. Lauren thought she was tightening the net. She was stepping deeper into a trap my uncle had set long before either of us ever met. And every threat she made was another piece of evidence she'd eventually have to answer for. Lauren didn't back off. She escalated. A few days after Michael finished reviewing everything, flyers started appearing around the neighborhood. They were taped to mailboxes, slipped under doors, and pinned to the community board near the entrance. Every one of them announced an emergency HOA meeting. The language was dramatic and vague, warning residents about a non-compliant property, threatening safety and property values. My address wasn't listed, but everyone knew exactly who it was about. I didn't argue publicly. I didn't respond online. I didn't knock on doors to defend myself. I showed up calm, prepared, and quiet. The meeting was held in the community center, a bland room with folding chairs, bad lighting, and a long table at the front where Lauren sat like a judge. She wore a blazer and had stacks of paper arranged neatly beside her, already projecting authority before she said a word. Residents filled the room, some curious, some nervous, some clearly there because they had been summoned rather than invited. Lauren opened the meeting with practiced confidence. She talked about standards, safety, and protecting investments. She talked about how one property could undermine an entire neighborhood if it wasn't brought into compliance. She never used my name, but she pointed in my direction more than once. Then she unveiled what she believed would end the discussion. She projected documents onto a screen behind her, claiming they proved my uncle had voluntarily joined the HOA years earlier. She spoke slowly, explaining dates and signatures, pausing just long enough for the room to absorb the implication. Murmurs spread through the crowd. A few people nodded. Others looked uncomfortable but unsure. I watched faces carefully. Some residents wanted to believe her, because believing her meant this was simple. It meant the problem wasn't the HOA. It was me. When she finished, Lauren looked directly at me and said it was time for enforcement. That's when I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her of lying. I didn't insult anyone. I walked to the front of the room and handed copies of my documents to the board members one by one. I started with the recorded exclusion agreement. I explained what it was, when it was filed, and why it permanently barred any HOA authority over my land. I showed the official recording stamps, the original signatures, the dates that predated the HOA itself. Then I showed the survey. I pointed out the boundary lines, the measurements, and the markers placed by a licensed professional. I explained calmly that the HOA's decorative fence had been built on my property for years without permission. The room got quieter. Then I explained the penalty clauses. Every unauthorized enforcement action triggered financial consequences, every notice, every inspection, every fine. I explained that these weren't hypothetical penalties. They were enforceable terms already reviewed by legal counsel. Lauren shifted in her chair. Finally, I played the audio. It was Ethan's voice, clear and unmistakable, offering to settle this quietly, implying payments and consequences if I didn't cooperate. The room froze. People stopped whispering. A few heads turned toward Lauren, waiting for her to explain something she clearly hadn't prepared for. Lauren tried to regain control. She interrupted. She accused me of misrepresentation. She said the documents were being reviewed. She said the board would decide. But the room had changed. Neighbors weren't whispering about me anymore. They were whispering about her. About the forged documents. About the fence. About the recordings. Fear had been the foundation of her authority. People paid because they were scared. They stayed quiet because they didn't want to be next. That fear cracked the moment the truth walked in. By the time the meeting adjourned, nothing had been voted on. Lauren announced a recess, claiming the board needed time. But everyone could see what was happening. Her control was slipping, not because I shouted, but because I proved she never had the right to hold it in the first place. As people filed out, several neighbors stopped to talk to me. Some apologized. Some admitted they'd been fined unfairly. Others just said they were glad someone finally stood up. Lauren didn't look at me as she packed up her papers. She didn't need to. The authority she built on intimidation had collapsed in a single evening, and for the first time since this began, the outcome was no longer uncertain. That meeting wasn't loud. It didn't end with shouting or security escorting anyone out. But it was the end. Within days, the tone of everything changed. The HOA stopped sending notices. Emails went unanswered. The security patrols disappeared from my road like they had never existed. That silence wasn't peace. It was retreat. County officials stepped in first. The forged documents Lauren had presented didn't just raise eyebrows, they raised jurisdictional questions. Investigators requested originals, timelines were compared, recording stamps were verified. What Lauren had tried to pass off as old paperwork unraveled quickly once it was placed next to the real records. Then the pattern started to surface. Other homeowners came forward. Some brought letters identical to mine, just with different names and addresses. Others had inspection notices, unexplained fines, and threats of liens that had never quite made legal sense. When investigators lined everything up, it became clear this wasn't a single dispute. It was a method. Insurance carriers were next. Once the forged paperwork and boundary violations were flagged, coverage became a liability risk. Policies were reviewed. Questions were asked. Then the letters went out. Coverage was pulled. Without insurance, the HOA couldn't operate the way it had been. That's when the lawsuits began. Homeowners filed claims to recover fines they had paid under pressure. Legal actions targeted unauthorized enforcement, harassment, and property encroachment. The penalty clauses in my exclusion agreement were triggered one by one. Each enforcement attempt adding another line item to the ledger. Lauren and her husband weren't arrested that night. Real consequences don't work that way. Instead, something far worse happened for them. They lost control. The HOA board was dissolved under oversight. Elections were suspended. Financial records were frozen and reviewed. What had once been a tool of intimidation turned into a liability no one wanted their name attached to. Lauren stopped showing up. Her husband stopped calling. The rules they had used like weapons were turned inward, dissected, and applied correctly for the first time. Compliance audits replaced scare tactics. Documentation replaced threats. Every shortcut they had taken came back into focus under scrutiny. People who had been afraid started speaking openly. Meetings became calm. Voices that had been quiet for years finally filled the room. Restitution claims piled up, not fueled by anger, but by paperwork and receipts. And that was the most satisfying part. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting match, no final speech, just the slow, methodical collapse of an operation that only functioned because people were scared to question it. Lauren built her authority on fear and assumption. She assumed no one would check. She assumed no one would push back. She assumed intimidation would always be cheaper than truth. She was wrong. Poetic justice doesn't scream. It doesn't need to. It documents. The change didn't happen overnight, but it was impossible to miss once it started. In the weeks after the board was dissolved, the neighborhood felt quieter in a different way. Not tense, not watchful, just calm. The kind of calm that comes when people stop waiting for the next threat to drop. For years, everyone had lived with a low, level hum of anxiety, checking mail with a knot in their stomach. Second, guessing every small decision about their own homes. That hum faded. People who had been silent for years began to talk. At first, it was cautious. One neighbor stopped by to ask if I thought they could get their fines back. Another admitted they had paid fees they never fully understood just to keep the peace. As more information came out, so did the stories. Letters, receipts, emails saved out of fear rather than confidence. Slowly, systematically, refunds started to happen. Not all at once and not easily, but they happened. Money that had been taken through pressure and confusion made its way back to the people who had earned it. The rules changed too. Without Lauren steering every decision, the remaining homeowners rewrote the HOA guidelines from the ground up. They stripped out vague language. They removed enforcement shortcuts. They added clear limits to board authority. Meetings became discussions instead of announcements. Votes mattered again. For the first time, the HOA actually resembled what it was supposed to be, a cooperative, not a weapon. The fence came down in early spring. I watched contractors remove the decorative panels piece by piece, loading them onto trucks paid for by HOA funds. When the last post came out of the ground, the new survey markers stood alone, quiet and undeniable. The land looked bigger without the fence, not just physically, but emotionally. It was proof that boundaries matter, and that ignoring them has consequences. My workshop changed too. Before all of this, I worked there alone. Afterward, neighbors started showing up with small problems. A loose step, a broken hinge, a shelf that needed fixing. Nothing official, nothing documented. Just people helping people again. The place that had been targeted and threatened became something useful, something human. Even the gate felt different. I rebuilt it stronger than before, thicker posts, heavier hinges, a lock that didn't flinch when it closed. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted it to stand as a reminder. That gate wasn't about keeping people out. It was about marking where authority ended. Some evenings, I'd sit on the porch and watch the road. Cars passed without slowing. No patrols, no clipboards, no flashlights cutting across my yard. Just neighbors heading home, minding their own business. For the first time since this began, my life stopped revolving around paperwork and deadlines. I could focus on my mother, on my work, on breathing again. Peace didn't arrive with an announcement. It arrived quietly, the way it should have been all along. When I look back on everything that happened, the part that still unsettles me isn't the threats, the fines, or even the way my land was treated like something that could be taken if someone spoke loudly enough. What scares me most is how easily power can be abused when people assume it's legitimate and stop asking questions. Lauren didn't rely on the law. She relied on exhaustion, on fear, on the idea that people would rather comply than push back, especially when they were already tired or hurting. She counted on grief slowing me down. She counted on silence doing the rest. What she didn't count on was paperwork. She didn't count on patience. And she didn't count on the fact that some land was never hers to touch, no matter how many notices she printed or meetings she called. My mother passed a few months later. By then, the letters had stopped, the fence was gone, and the road outside my gate was quiet again. When I told her it was finally over, she smiled. Not because I had beaten anyone, but because she knew I would be able to breathe again. That smile mattered more than any ruling or refund ever could. If there's one thing I hope people take from this, it's that authority should always be questioned when it shows up uninvited. Rules only matter when they're real, and power only works when people believe in it. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?